From a world-famous surgeon whose life-saving invention was officially declared dangerous by doctors, to a revolutionary leader who campaigned to ban the death penalty before executing 40,000 people, to a battlefield hero whose severed head spent 300 years as a pub novelty before finally being buried when Elvis Presley was on the radio, history is packed with people who started out as the ultimate good guys only to pull a complete 180. You know that famous line from The Dark Knight? You either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. It sounds like a dramatic movie quote, but if you look at the actual history books, it is basically a law of nature. And the reasons these heroes go dark aren't just grand, evil master plans. Most of the time, they turn into monsters for reasons that are petty, absurd, and completely human. Let's start in Paris, in the spring of 1791. Picture a quiet, bookish lawyer standing at a podium in front of the French government. His name is Maximilien Robespierre, and he is giving a fiery, passionate speech about human rights. His number one target? The death penalty. Robespierre argues that state-sanctioned killing is barbaric, useless, and deeply immoral. The people love him for this. They call him the incorruptible because he cares so much about the common man. But here is where living too long gets tricky. A couple of years later, the French Revolution gets messy. Foreign kings invade, bread riots break out, and paranoia sweeps the streets. Robespierre gets put in charge of emergency security. And suddenly, our pacifist lawyer decides that the only way to protect freedom is with just a tiny bit of murder. Well, actually, a lot of murder. He launches what we now call the Reign of Terror. He builds an assembly line for the guillotine, chopping off over 16,000 heads officially, and tens of thousands more off the books. Anyone who disagrees with him is labeled an enemy of liberty. He gets so drunk on his own self-righteousness that he literally invents his own religion, the cult of the Supreme Being, and throws a massive festival where he dresses up in a sky blue coat and parades around as the high priest of reason. His fellow revolutionaries look at him cosplaying as a god and realize the guy has completely lost his mind. The next day, they turn on him. Robespierre tries to shoot himself with a pocket pistol, but he flinched, missed his brain, and shattered his own lower jaw. He spent his final hours unable to speak before being dragged up to the very same guillotine he industrialized. The man who wanted to abolish the death penalty became the most famous execution in human history. But speaking of guys whose big principles got torched by petty reality, let's cross the Atlantic to the American Revolution. Ask anyone today what the name Benedict Arnold means, and they will tell you it means a backstabbing traitor. But if you died in 1777, you would have remembered him as the undisputed action hero of American independence. During the Battle of Saratoga, which was the absolute turning point of the war, Arnold defied orders, rode his horse straight into enemy fire, rallied the American troops, and won the day. His leg was shattered by a British musket ball in the charge. There is literally a boot monument at Saratoga today that honors his heroic leg, but purposely leaves his name off the plaque. So how does America's greatest patriot turn around and try to sell out the fort at West Point to the British Army? Well, it wasn't just about ideology. It was about an expense report. See, during the war, the Continental Congress was broke, so Arnold paid for his soldiers' food, blankets, and clothes out of his own pocket. He kept all the receipts, over 10,000 pounds worth of personal spending. When he submitted his expense claim to Congress for reimbursement, the bureaucrats basically said, yeah, we're not paying this, and by the way, your math looks sketchy. Imagine sacrificing your leg for your country, and your boss rejects your travel reimbursement. Arnold was so furious about being unpaid and passed over for promotions that he decided if America wouldn't pay him back, the King of England definitely would. He literally sold out the revolution over an audit. Now, turning against your government over money is bad enough. But what happens when you overthrow an entire monarchy because you hate tyrants, only to become a tyrant yourself? Enter Oliver Cromwell. In 17th century England, King Charles I was acting like a divine right dictator, bypassing parliament and taxing the public dry. Cromwell, a minor country farmer with zero military training, rises up, builds an army from scratch, and utterly crushes the royalists. In 1649, he signs the king's death warrant and chops his head off. Cromwell is hailed as the champion of liberty and democracy. But here is the problem with guys who believe God is personally whispering in their ear. Once the king is gone, Cromwell looks at the parliament he just saved and decides they are arguing too much. So he marches his soldiers into the House of Commons, points at the speaker's mace, calls it a fool's bauble, and shuts the entire government down. He declares himself Lord Protector, which is just a fancy 17th century phrase for military dictator. He bans Christmas, shuts down theaters, and launches a military campaign in Ireland so brutal that thousands of surrendered soldiers and civilians are massacred at towns like Drogheda. By the time he dies of natural causes in 1658, everyone is so exhausted by his Puritan dictatorship that they literally invite the old king's son back from exile to take the throne. And King Charles II held a serious grudge. 3 years after Cromwell died, the royalists dug up his rotting corpse, put it on trial for treason, hanged it in chains, chopped off its head, and stuck that head on a 20-foot spike outside Westminster Hall. And I am not making this up. That severed head blew down in a storm decades later, got picked up by a soldier, and spent the next 300 years being bought, sold, exhibited in freak shows, and passed around at drunken parties before it was finally buried in a secret college grave in Cambridge in 1960. The guy who killed a king ended up as a pub novelty during the Cold War. But let's step away from generals and politicians for a second, because the hero-to-villain pipeline isn't just for military guys. Sometimes it happens in a chemistry lab. If you had to pick one human being who saved more lives than anyone else in history, the scientific answer is a German chemist named Fritz Haber. At the turn of the 20th century, scientists warned that the global population was growing faster than our ability to grow food. Humanity was running out of natural nitrogen fertilizer, and mass starvation was guaranteed. Enter Haber. In 1908, he figured out how to pull nitrogen directly out of the thin air and combine it with hydrogen under intense pressure to create synthetic ammonia. It is called the Haber-Bosch process, and it literally revolutionized agriculture. Today, nearly half the nitrogen atoms in your own body were created by this exact process. He won the Nobel Prize, and his invention is the reason 4 billion of us are alive today. Absolute hero status, right? Well, just wait until 1914. When World War I breaks out, Haber doesn't stick to fertilizer. He is a fierce nationalist who decides to use his genius for the German military. He realizes that the exact same chemistry skill can be used to make poison. He personally oversees the development of chlorine gas, and in 1915, he travels to the front lines at Ypres to watch thousands of Allied soldiers choked to death in a yellow cloud. He became the undisputed father of chemical warfare. His own wife, Clara, who was also a brilliant PhD chemist, was so horrified by what her husband had done to science that she took his military pistol and shot herself in their garden. And the dark irony doesn't stop there. Decades later, the pesticide research instituted by Haber's laboratory would be developed into Zyklon B, the exact gas used by the Nazi regime to murder over 1 million people in the Holocaust, including members of Haber's own extended Jewish family. He fed half the world and gave birth to the weapons that terrorized the other half. And speaking of medical lifesavers who went completely off the rails, let me ask you a question. What do you do if you are at a restaurant and someone starts turning blue on a piece of steak? You stand behind them, wrap your arms around their waist, and give a sharp upward thrust, the Heimlich maneuver. Invented in 1974 by a thoracic surgeon named Drive Henry Heimlich. It was a stroke of absolute brilliance that replaced the old, dangerous advice of slapping choking people in the back. He became an instant international celebrity, saving thousands of lives, including mayors, actors, and ordinary kids. But here's where living too long turns a hero into a mad scientist. Once Dr. Heimlich tasted global fame, he decided his maneuver wasn't just for choking. He started campaigning aggressively that people should use abdominal thrusts on drowning victims instead of CPR. Now, medically speaking, this is a terrible idea. If you squeeze the stomach of a drowning person, they throw up water and stomach acid, inhale it into their lungs, and suffocate faster. The Red Cross and the American Heart Association begged him to stop, but Heimlich refused. He attacked the medical community, claiming there was a giant conspiracy against him. Then, in the 1980s and 90s, he went even further. He started advocating something called malariotherapy. He genuinely believed that you could cure cancer, Lyme disease, and HIV by deliberately infecting patients with malaria, thinking the high fevers would burn out the viruses. He even conducted human trials in China and Mexico that were widely condemned as atrocious human rights violations. The medical world was so embarrassed by their former hero that in 2006, the American Red Cross officially stripped his name from their rescue guidelines. They changed it to simply abdominal thrusts. The man who invented the most famous life-saving hug in history lived long enough to have his own name canceled from his own invention. Now, losing the naming rights to your invention is embarrassing, but what if your villain arc involves handing your entire country over to Adolf Hitler? Let's talk about Philippe Pétain. If you were a Frenchman in 1918, Pétain wasn't just a general, he was a god. During the First World War, he commanded French forces at the Battle of Verdun, the longest, bloodiest meat grinder in military history. When other generals were throwing men into machine gun fire, Pétain took care of his troops, rotated them out, and famously declared of the invading Germans, "They shall not pass." He saved France from total destruction and earned the nickname the Lion of Verdun. After the war, he was promoted to Marshal of France, the highest honor in the land. If he had died at 60, 70, or even 80 years old, every town in France would have a massive boulevard named after him today. But Pétain lived and lived. Fast forward 22 years to 1940. World War II breaks out, and Nazi tanks smash through French defenses in weeks. The government collapses, and who do the French people turn to in their hour of desperation? Their 84-year-old World War I savior. They make Pétain prime minister, hoping he will save them again. Instead, the Lion of Verdun takes one look at Hitler's army and decides resistance is useless. He signs an armistice, dissolves the French democracy, and sets up a puppet state known as Vichy France. He doesn't just surrender, he actively collaborates. His regime passes brutal anti-Semitic laws without even being asked by the Germans, rounding up thousands of French Jews and shipping them off to death camps. When the Allies finally liberated France in 1944, the 88-year-old former savior was put on trial for high treason. He spent the trial sitting in a chair, pretending to be deaf and senile, while prosecutors laid out how the man who once said, "They shall not pass," literally held the door open for the Nazis. He was condemned to death, which was only commuted to life imprisonment because of his age and old war record. He died in a prison fortress, a national hero turned national disgrace. And that brings us to our final, most modern example of a liberator who simply stayed at the party 40 years too long. In the 1960s and 70s, the African nation of Zimbabwe, then called Rhodesia, was ruled by a brutal white minority government. A former schoolteacher named Robert Mugabe spent 10 years in prison for speaking out, then led a fierce guerrilla war that finally achieved majority rule and independence in 1980. When he became prime minister, the whole world celebrated. He preached racial reconciliation, built schools, expanded healthcare, and was even awarded an honorary knighthood by the British monarchy. He was the ultimate anti-colonial hero. But remember what we said about people who believe they are the sole embodiment of liberty? They start believing that anyone who opposes them is opposing freedom itself. Within 3 years of taking power, Mugabe faced political opposition in the western provinces of his country. So what did the great liberator do? He secretly brought in military instructors from North Korea, trained a personal elite unit called the 5th Brigade, and unleashed them on his own citizens. In an atrocity known as the Gukurahundi, his forces massacred 20,000 civilians to wipe out any trace of political opposition. And from there, the slide into villainy was absolute. To reward his loyal cronies and maintain his grip on power, Mugabe seized commercial farms, handing them over to people who didn't know how to farm. The economy collapsed, food production evaporated, and the government ran out of cash. So Mugabe did the only thing a desperate dictator knows how to do. He turned on the printing presses. By 2008, Zimbabwe was trapped in the worst hyperinflation crisis of the 21st century. Prices were doubling every 24 hours. You literally needed a wheelbarrow full of cash just to buy a single loaf of bread or a bus ticket. The inflation rate hit an astronomical 79.6 billion%. It got so ridiculous that the central bank had to issue a $100 trillion banknote. That is a 1 followed by 14 zeros on a single piece of paper. And it was worth less than 40 cents. While ordinary citizens were starving and trying to spend trillion-dollar bills before they lost value by lunchtime, Mugabe was throwing himself multi-million-dollar birthday parties with imported champagne and giant cakes. By the time he was finally ousted by his own military at age 93, the man who freed Zimbabwe had turned his country's economy into a joke and his name into a synonym for greed. So when you look at Robespierre screaming on the scaffold, Arnold checking his unpaid receipts, or Mugabe holding a $100 trillion bill, Harvey Dent's old warning stops sounding like a comic book quote and starts sounding like a law of nature. Why does this keep happening? Because heroism requires a specific type of human being, someone who is stubborn, uncompromising, and completely convinced that they are right against all odds. On a battlefield or in a revolution, that trait is a superpower. But once the war is won and the enemy is gone, that superpower doesn't just turn off. The hero looks around for a new monster to fight, and eventually, the only thing left to conquer is the very people they saved. They stop listening. They surround themselves with yes men, and they confuse their own personal survival with the survival of the nation. The applause curdles into fear, but by then, they're too addicted to the stage to walk away. So here's my question for you. Is there a modern hero walking around right now, in politics, tech, or culture, who has already crossed that line without us noticing yet? Let me know who you think is loading their villain arc right now. And trust me, if you thought these 7 fell hard, just wait until you hear the story of the scientists who accidentally poisoned the entire planet while trying to invent a better refrigerator. I will see you on the next one.